Hi everyone, this is Charlize from Forward Chess, and today we're going to continue our opening series and talk about the London system. So the London system, first of all, starts off with d4. Black can respond in various ways. d5, knight f6, even c5. But the important thing I want to talk about here is that we can enter the London either via knight f3 or bishop f4. The bishop will come to f4 eventually in the knight f3 lines, but our main focus is going to be bishop f4. This has become super popular over the years, in recent years, moving our bishop out first for various reasons. First of all, it avoids bringing the knight out, so black can't bring their bishop out later and attack this knight on f3. Right, so let's talk about the London system. What is it exactly? I'm going to leave my bishop right here. So there is no definite history on the name origins of the London system. Like there's no, super great London, player from London who made it up. It just was very active, I guess, in London tournaments, so that's how it got its name. But the system part of the opening name is quite important to understand. So a system in chess is when you have an easy setup to play for whichever side is playing the system. You have a consistent set of moves that you play, and basically this set of moves can be a response to anything your opponent plays. So it's super solid, super easy, generally quite easy to learn and to understand. And that is why the London has become so popular. You have probably heard of it before, either from players who use it, who play it and achieve amazing results, or from players who don't like playing against it because it can be quite annoying to play against such a solid setup. So today we're just going to look at an overview of some of the theory and talk about how you can learn the London system. We're working from the Forward Chess web app, specifically in the great book on the London system called The London System, The Adventure Continues by Nicholas Sedlak. Now, it's important to just mention about this book. They do recommend knight f3 before bishop f4, but a lot of the positions are going to transpose into what we're going to look at. So nevertheless, this is a great book to learn the London with. So let's get into some theory, starting with knight f6 and e6 setups. Our move order is d4, d5, bishop f4, knight f6, e3, e6. Now, this is one of the most common type of London setups. White's main moves, let's use some arrows. White's main moves include bringing the knight to f3, bringing the pawn to c3, particularly when black attacks with c5. So your response will usually be to build this nice little pawn chain with c3. The b2 knight will go to d2, and the light squared bishop will go to d3. You have most probably seen this type of robust London system setup, and this is basically what the opening is known for. It's important for white to not allow black to get e5 in. And usually a plan to remember is that we take our knight to f3, e5, just to control the square later on. We'll see this in a game example. Black usually will also just focus on developing harmoniously. The dark squared bishop comes to d6 to challenge our London bishop, and black gets in c5, the knight comes to c6, and we will see the kind of setup that can be played in a typical line, such as from this position after e6 we play knight f3. Now that, note, the black's bishop cannot come to g4 to pin our knight, so it's completely safe. c5, black gains a little bit of space on the queen side, aiming to challenge our center. We defend, as mentioned, with c3. Now there are lines where black captures on d4. You should definitely take a look at that, but we are going to continue looking at knight c6. We continue with the usual development, knight bd2, bishop d6, challenging our bishop. Now there are lines where white leaves the bishop on f4. Most of the times the bishop comes back to g3, but there are lines where white leaves the bishop on f4 and allows black to just capture. And although we get double pawns, we have great control over this e5 square. But in our line, we're looking at bishop g3, castle, and then bishop d3. Now this is our normal London setup. White can castle kingside next. Black captures on g3 quite a lot, but black waits for white to castle before capturing on g3. From this position, black has quite a few options. One of the main ones I want to look at is if black plays b6. Now the point of b6 is that black needs to develop this light squared bishop since it's not going anywhere because of this e6 pawn. So b7 is a natural square. There are a few options here for white. Castling, of course, bringing the queen to e2, and knight e5, controlling that e5 square. Another really cool option that I want to show today is e4. Now e4, of course, the threat is e5. Black can capture the pawn, we can have a lot of trades, but I want to show you a cool little game of mine that I had a few years ago. Black played bishop e7, of course, just wanting to avoid this e5 move. e5 comes anyway, and now you should really look into this line. It's pretty interesting. Black's best move is to play knight h5, and then white's best move is to play knight g5. So e5 comes anyway. In the game, black played knight d7. Of course, knight h5 is a much better move, but knight d7 came on the board. And now, as you can see, and something that is quite common in a lot of London lines, is that you get this really cool kingside attack. And that's exactly what happened in this game. So white played h4. Note, because white hasn't castled yet, there are opportunities like this to just push the pawn and kind of create havoc. Black played f6. Now the best move is to immediately go for knight g5. We'll look at this now, but I went for bishop takes h7. Bishop takes h7, Greek gift kind of style, and let's see what happens. Now, after king takes h7, maybe you want to pause the video and try to see the continuation. White here completely took advantage of this h-file. The reason the h-pawn was pushed is because of this cool move, knight g5. Now, knight g5 opens up the queen. This is quite common in Greek gift sacrifices. You have a few combinations. You need the knight coming in, you need the queen coming in. Usually you need this pawn on e5 as well to just cover any escape squares. So after knight g5, takes, check. Now a few pieces have been sacrificed, but we'll see why. After king g8, again, this is quite a cool little tactic you should try to see if you can solve. And let's take a look at the cool move, rook h8, another sacrifice, a third in a row. And after black captured, queen h5, king g8, g6, and the game is lost. Checkmate is coming next. So yeah, this is just a cool little example I wanted to show you of how aggressive lines can get. But basically the reason is that white has such a great and easy setup that, you know, you get a great position, a comfortable position, and tactics can happen. Next up, let's take a look at g6 setups by black, following the move order d4, knight f6, bishop f4, and then g6. These setups often resemble King's Indian or Grunfeld defenses. Black allows white to occupy the center, but aims to claim it back or challenge it later. So from this position as white, you have two main ways to respond, and they are to either go for the normal setup with e3, or to go for a different line, which is knight c3. Let's take a look at both. Now, first of all, e3. This keeps in line with the system that we saw in the previous line. We kind of want to develop our pieces basically in the same way. We will use our normal London system approach with the knight coming to f3, the b knight coming to d2, and c3 as well. Now, black's plans, on the other hand, let's change our color once again. Let's give black blue. Black aims to continue development by fianchettoing the bishop, following up with d6, castling, and knight bd7. Eventually, black will want to challenge the center either with a move like c5 or e5. Let's look at a typical line. After e3, black goes bishop g7, knight f3, castle, bishop e2. Note that we're playing bishop e2 and not bishop d3. You can go for bishop d3, but just in terms of logic, what makes sense, this bishop is now looking into two of these pawns, these two black pawns, and that's a pretty solid kind of setup to have against a bishop, because of course we want open diagonals and the pawns are blocking that diagonal. So it is common for this bishop instead to go to e2. After d6, another typical move to remember in this line for white is this h3 move. h3 does a lot of things. We're not necessarily defending g4, although it comes with the h3 move, but we're also opening up for our bishop to come back to h2 whenever necessary. Like, we don't want to trade this London bishop for black's knight, so we're making a little space, a little home for the bishop to just come back to. After h3, let's take a look at the line knight bd7. Now white castles, and this is our typical line. As mentioned, black can go for e5, black can go for c5, and there are many ways for the game to continue here, but this is just one of them. As you can see, white is pretty solid, white is comfortable, and white has their London moves. Now let's take a look at knight c3. Knight c3 played after g6 immediately. Now you can see that this is different to our usual setups. In the London, we spoke about the pawn coming to c3, but this knight to c3 move is quite an interesting approach, and it's a little bit tricky for black to play against. The idea of white bringing the knight to c3, let's go back to our green, is that we want to play e4. We want to completely dominate this center because black doesn't have any pawns in the center. We want to challenge it by putting two pawns in the center and just gaining a lot of space. So black in this position has two main ways to respond. They can either allow white to occupy the center and play bishop g7, or they can say, no, you know what, we don't really want you to have two pawns in the center, so let's play d5. Let's take a look at both of these options. Now, d5 is, of course, not allowing e4. And although this knight on c3 might look a little bit funky, it does come into great use. So after d5, white continues with e3, our usual setup. I want you to just take note of the positions that come up and how familiar they can be, so you understand why exactly this is called a system. So black continues, bishop g7, and now white can continue with knight f3 developing normally, but a cool move here is h4. This h4 move is just expanding on the king side. The threat is also to push h5 and just completely open up black's king side, making it very scary to castle that side. Usually black responds by playing h5 just to stop our pawn from just stomping through. And play may continue with knight f3, castle, and knight e5, just taking space in the position. Black usually goes for a move like c5, breaking open the position, or going for the center a little bit. Let's go back. As mentioned, instead of h4, if this looks a little bit too much, of course it's not necessary. You can just continue with knight f3 immediately. I just want to look at the move after knight f3. Black should castle here, but let's say black goes for a quiet type of normal looking move, knight c6. Now I say this is normal looking because, you know, you're just developing your pieces, but we'll talk about why this knight shouldn't go to c6 other than this cool tactic coming up. White's response to knight c6 is knight b5, and of course we are hitting the c7 pawn. Black can't really do anything about it, and we're just going to capture it next and be a full pawn up on move 6 of the game. Let's go back to just talk about why this knight shouldn't come to c6, you know, other than the obvious blunder. If you're playing against d4 openings, a method of playing against d4 openings that I like to remember is what to do with this c pawn. If your opponent pushes their c pawn forward, as black now, most of the times your pawn will come to c6 to defend your d pawn, or even c5. Of course, we've got those kind of variations. But if your opponent doesn't push their c pawn forward, as white hasn't done in this position, c5 is always a move you want to include. So basically, when you're playing against d4 openings, you just want to wait to see what's going to happen. You don't want to immediately bring this knight out, because if you do, then of course chances, you know, the chance to move the c7 pawn is not there anymore. So just be a little bit patient. Let's continue with our line. So this was our line of looking at d5. Let's say black instead doesn't play d5. Now, if black goes for bishop g7 instead of d5, this leads to a complex battle that can transpose into a few other openings, like the Perk modern defense or King's Indian, and we'll take a look at a possible line that can come up. After bishop g7, the reason for knight c3 comes into play, and that's to go for e4, just completely taking advantage of the space in the center. A few ideas for white to remember here is that you can go for queen d2 and queen side castle. The idea is that you want to line your queen and your bishop up to eventually get a bishop h6. This is a common way of playing against fianchetto positions, which is the bishop coming to g7, and white's basically just wants to cause some chaos in black's castle position. h4 is also an idea that comes later, and you basically just have this crazy kingside attack and you aim to weaken black's position. Let's take a look at a possible line after e4. d6 just to stop e5, otherwise these pawns are just marching forward. Queen d2, as mentioned, we're lining up this queen and bishop duo, looking at this h6 square eventually. Castle, white queenside castles. Now this can become a super aggressive game, because just as we are going to be looking at attacking the black king, black of course will be looking to attack the white king. And black will do that by bringing the black queen out to a5 after pushing c6, b5, just causing a little bit of an attack on the queen side. So it's going to be a bit of an attack race, you could call it. And yeah, there are a lot of games, a lot of lines, interesting lines to look at here. Black can continue with development, knight bd7 and bishop h6. This is just where we're going to stop, and I want to show you how white will continue in a position like this. h4 is going to come usually after c6, b5. You also just want to defend with the pawn coming to f3. And yeah, there are a lot of cool games that come from this type of position. We aren't exactly in London territory right now, but you could definitely take a look at these kind of positions. So next up, and finally, let's look at c5 setups from black. So our c5 setups, I'll look at the c5 setups, is going to be in two parts, because black can either go for d5 immediately or go for knight f6 first and not bring out d5. Let's take a look at d5 first. d4, d5, bishop f4. Black goes for an immediate attack on our center with c5. Of course, white can capture. There are lines where white does. But the best or most played is e3, just supporting this d pawn, opening up for the bishop. Again, this is quite normal in London setups. After knight c6, c3, play can continue with knight f6. This is one of black's main moves, but I want to take a look at this interesting queen b6. Now, as a London player, you always need to be prepared for lines like this. This is one of the more popular ways to play against the London, or at least in recent times it's becoming quite popular for black. Black brings out the queen and takes advantage of our London bishop that is out, and left this b2 pawn weak without any defense. So the black queen comes out and immediately attacks this hanging pawn. Now, white can either defend the pawn with queen c2 or queen b3, but I want to look at a line that is quite funky and you need to know from both sides. So after queen b3, this move might look a little bit strange, like, can't black just take our queen? Well, yes, black can take our queen, and we will take back, but we don't mind this. This is actually quite a nice position, because yes, we have double pawns. However, we do have this open file for our rook, and these double pawns can always march forward. The bishop can come out, and this is by no means a weak position for white. Let's continue though. Most of the times black won't capture your queen, but if black does, you won't mind it. Black instead takes advantage of your queen coming out early and attacking it with c4. Now, just as we didn't mind black taking our queen, black also doesn't mind us capturing their queen. So what you don't want to do here is capture the queen, because once again, yes, there are double pawns, but these are not weak. The rook has a nice open file. Let's get our blue arrow going. This rook has a nice open file, but more importantly, these pawns can just at any time march forward and completely take advantage of this weak white queen side. These pawns are not weak, and it is not the best position to play against. So we don't capture the queen, we instead come back. Now, the line that I want to show you is a line that you would really only know if you know your theory, but as London has become so popular, you should be prepared for your opponent to know this. And that is this move e5. We're going to understand why this move is important, but let's take a look at the idea. Now, e5, we capture the pawn back, and here is black's whole reason for playing e5, and that is to bring this bishop to f5. But isn't that just a hanging piece? Well, yes, it is, but it is also a poisonous piece. The idea is that black wants us to capture this free bishop, because then the b2 pawn has been left unguarded and black can just capture it and go for our hanging rook next. And we are pretty much lost in this position. So after bishop f5, we don't capture the bishop, we instead come back to c1. Let's take a look at this e5 move, because this is a little bit of a strange move. Let's see what happens if black doesn't play e5 and instead goes for bishop f5 immediately. Now, we will see the reason behind e5 is that in this line, white can capture the bishop, because if black captures on b2, white can capture on d5. Now, capturing on d5 allows black to, of course, capture this rook. So after black captures on a1, this position is very different to the previous one in the fact that white is actually okay here. And we can put on our engine to take a look at the position. You can change the size of the board. Ours is just super big because we want to see everything for the YouTube video. But if I decrease the board size over here, I can see the stockfish analysis showing that it's +1.5, which means that it is a pretty good position for white. White will just play queen b5, and this queen b5 move is basically just holding the whole position for white. b7 is hanging, this queen isn't doing anything on a1, and it's pretty much out of the game. So this position is good for white. But if black remembers this e5 move, let's take a look. If e5 does come on the board, we capture bishop f5, and then we capture. Now you can see that the stockfish tells us a very different story, and that black is better in this position. So going back to our starting position, we just took a look at d4, d5, bishop f4, and c5. Now we're going to look at black not going for d5, but instead going for knight f6 first. After bishop f4, the c5 move comes immediately. Now, again, black is immediately challenging our center, and there's going to be quite an important line here for both sides to learn, and let's take a look at that. So again, we're going to defend with e3, building our nice pawn chain, opening up for our light squared bishop, and in this line, black can go for queen b6 immediately. Now, once again, queen b6 attacks this weak b2 pawn that's been left behind by the bishop, who's doing its own thing on this f4 square, on this nice diagonal. And the b2 pawn is a bit of a liability in some of these positions, but as we saw, we can either defend it, or in this line that we're going to take a look at, we're just simply going to allow black to capture on b2. Let's look at a typical continuation. After queen b6, the best and not so obvious move here for white is to play knight c3. There are lines with knight a3, basically it's the same thing. We're going to look at knight c3. After queen b6, you don't want to play a move like b3, because just look how bad this queen side is. I mean, your dark squared bishop that can actually defend these weak dark squares is sitting on f4 away from the squares. So b3 is not the ideal move in a position like this. Instead, you will give up that pawn and play knight c3. Now, the idea of knight c3 is that after queen takes b2, white has knight b5. What's the idea of knight b5? Well, our London bishop on f4 and our knights are working together, but more importantly, this knight can go to c7. That's the threat right now. This knight wants to hop on over to c7 and fork the black king and rook. Now black responds by playing knight d5. Knight d5 not only defends the c7 square, it also attacks our bishop. And after knight d5, white goes for a3, just stopping the knight coming from b4. There are many different ways for white to play here. This is just one line I want to show you. After a6, white goes for rook b1, challenging this queen, because another important thing to remember, this knight on b5 does stop the black queen from retreating. So after rook b1, the only square left is queen a2. Now white can force a draw by just going, up and down, rook a1, rook b1, but we don't necessarily want to draw as white. That's not the ideal results you want to play for. So after queen a2, we control the squares with queen c1. We're going to take a look at why queen c1 is important. It covers this b2 square. So we give up our knight, black captures, and now rook a1, trapping the queen. Black captures, that's the only move for black, and we capture back. Now, we got black's queen, so it should be amazing for white, right? Well, actually, this position is slightly better for black. And yes, it is a position that black will most likely only achieve if they know their stuff. So it's important for both sides to know. And the reason is that after this position here, black must play e5 to open up for the dark squared bishop. And although we have the queen, black has the space, black has the development and the pawns, and this a3 pawn is going to become a bit of a problem for us in the future. So this is a bit of a tricky line to go into for both sides, and I would highly suggest that you look at it if you are going to be going for the London system. Now, of course, there are many different setups for both sides, and we haven't covered in all of them. But theory is developing. It's still a popular line. I mean, we even saw it in the Ding Nepo World Championship match. So it's still going to be around for quite a while, I think. Now, if you like this video and you want to take a look at playing the London system, of course, there's a lot to learn. There are a few different ways to use this opening. You can take a look on the Forward Chess website. We have many books. You just type in London system, search, and you will see quite a few different books coming up on the London system. Whether you're a beginner or an expert, there are options for really anyone. And if you check out our blog, you will also see the full article of everything we've spoken about today, a few book suggestions, and also cool games to look at, including the Ding Nepo game. Let us know in the comments which opening we should do next and what your opinion is on the London. If you have other cool variations you want us to talk about or that you play, and if we like the London or not, Team London or not, let us know. Bye.